welcome to Strategic Edge, a podcast by leaders and for leaders. We're here to inform, instruct, and inspire leaders. We're going to share information about business models, about theories, but then we're also going to provide instructions. How do you apply those? How do you make them very practical? And finally, we're going to encourage you to act. My name is Ted Davis. I'll be your podcast host and your leadership coach. I have been a practitioner, a student, and a teacher of leadership now for nearly 60 years. And as my future guests and I inform, instruct, and inspire you, I encourage you to do three things. First of all, absorb what we share with you. Make it your own. Take it on. Take notes. Make it your own thoughts. Make it part of what you now believe about leadership. Number two, reflect on it. What does it mean to you? What do we affirm that you're already doing? What ideas do you pick up about how to improve? And then thirdly, we want you to commit to an action plan so you can continue to move forward. So we want you to absorb, reflect, and commit. And with that, let's start today's podcast. Welcome. Well, I am thrilled in today's podcast to introduce you to a new friend of mine. Galen Bingham is a new friend. I've tracked him on LinkedIn for quite a while. I was excited about what he does. And so I invited him. And he took me up on it. And so welcome, Galen. I am just so thrilled to have you here today.
Well, I'm definitely excited to be here. I've checked out a few of your podcast conversations. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is the big time. I think I'm ready for the big time.
I don't know. I've checked out your podcast and I was like, oh my gosh, I'm a bush leaguer compared to this. But before I tell you people about your podcast, let me tell them about your career. You've had a very healthy sales career. You worked at Kraft General Foods for almost 6 years. And then you've had, it looks like at least one or two stints with Coca-Cola Company, North America. And then you had a general manager at Imperial Sugar. So a healthy sales background. You're married, you told me, for almost 29 years. A daughter that's 22. And where was the university?
She's a biochemistry major at Spelman College. And
Awesome.
man, she is the smartest, the cutest, the most talented little girl in the whole world. So I'm just excited.
But you're not biased about it.
Oh, I am totally biased. I am totally biased.
You got to be it for those kids. That's absolutely wonderful. Well, tell me a little bit more about how you got into sales.
Yeah, to be totally honest, I got into sales trying to follow behind my dad. My father spent, I don't know, 150 years in sales. He was working for Kraft General Foods at the time. I think as soon as I graduated from college, I put my application into a couple of different companies, and he wasn't satisfied with the level of the companies that I was applying to. So he walked my resume into Kraft General Foods. And wouldn't you know, they returned the email, they returned the phone message, and that began my career. The first week that I was working for Kraft General Foods, the senior vice president of sales came in and spoke to a group of us, and he encouraged us to look really high into the organization, try to find a position that we would love to have someday, and then start gearing our career to be prepared to sit for one of those jobs. And I said to myself, that's interesting, Mr. Rich Wazalowski, because I'd love to have your job someday. And that began my journey into trying to become senior vice president of sales for a Fortune 500 company.
That is awesome. So your father was a big draw. That is absolutely cool that your father saw that and put you on the right path.
Exactly.
And now, is he still with us?
He passed away 2 years ago in March. And I was just, again, just really amazed at how much he learned towards the end of his life that didn't make a whole lot of sense towards the beginning of mine. Just such wisdom that really did kind of sum up the way the world seems to work.
Oh, gosh, isn't it true? There's always more to learn. And even at my age, I keep thinking about, I wonder when my parents learned this. And did they even know it? So constantly learning. Well, the other thing that just caught my eye about your profile and what you're doing now, you have your own consulting firm, Kill global coaching and consulting. So it's global. We're doing this around the world, which is awesome. But you also have a podcast. Folks, pay attention to this name. I think this is the coolest name for a podcast there is. The podcast name is Whiskey, Jazz, and Leadership. Wow. I mean, I saw that. Okay, I got to pay attention to this one. So tell us how you got into that title. Is it just a marketing
Yeah.
gig?
No, actually, the Whiskey, Jazz, and Leadership podcast is my second podcast. The first one is called the Leadership Toolbox. And I formed the Leadership Toolbox while I was still in corporate America. So it was just straight inspirational, motivational stuff, the kind of thing that wouldn't get me fired from my company, wouldn't get me into too much trouble. And started when I left corporate America, I started doing some work for another company, and the founder said, Galen, you do great work, but there's something that you seem to be holding back. There's something that you seem to be reluctant to share. And whatever that is, I'm going to encourage you to bring that in to this project. And I thanked her politely. And then afterwards, after I hung up, I said, "This lady don't know me. How dare she say I do this, right?" And I spent the weekend thinking about what she said, and I decided she was right, that the way that I had found success in corporate America for almost 30 years as an African American, you give them enough, you give people enough to know that you've got, but if you give them too much, then that creates an experience where they can feel threatened. And so
Mhm.
I had done, again, a 30-year career going almost to the edge, but not quite. And after she gave me that advice, I decided that I would never ever do that again, that I was going to do what I enjoyed and I was going to go full out. And at that point, the Leadership Toolbox wasn't a true enough vehicle for me anymore. I like whiskey, I like jazz, I like leadership. And so that was the name of the podcast. I also fell in love with the metaphor that we built around it. So the metaphor of whiskey is doing what you enjoy with the folks you enjoyed with, irregardless of what those other folks might have to say about it. If they're not part of your crew, don't really pay a whole lot of attention to them. The metaphor of jazz is how do you get from where you are to where you need to be, even in situations where there's no sheet music, where the sheet music doesn't make sense anymore. You've got to improvise and figure it out. And that's the metaphor of jazz. And then for me, the metaphor of leadership is, marketing is fun. Strategy is really important. You got to have sales. You don't have sales, you don't have a business. But at the end of the day, nobody eats unless somebody kills something. Someone needs to stand up and say, we're taking this action today. And unless I get better information, this is the path we're taking. Until someone steps into that leadership space, then, we're just having a conversation. Nothing's ever going to change.
Wow. Well, that's most impressive. And I like the idea that you use metaphors. Long, long time ago, when I first started my teaching career, some of my students were complaining about another instructor and how she was using metaphors. And at the time, I thought, what are you talking about? We're here to teach. There's A, B, C. Here's the list. Here's the laundry list. Here's the formula. It was very kind of concrete type stuff. I don't know what it was, but maybe it was when I started working on my doctorate. I finally realized, whoa, metaphors are incredibly important.
Mhm.
Metaphors absolutely help people hopefully understand it. And so now I've gotten in the habit to use it. I bet you probably use the same metaphor an awful lot, and that's teams. What does teamwork relate to? Sports. And so I always go. So one of my metaphors is when I'm teaching teamwork is know what type of team you're on. I
Mm.
mean, are you on a baseball team, a football team, or a track team? Those are three different types. And don't try to make a track team behave like a football team. It
Exactly.
won't work. It will not work. Having tried that once upon a time, I can tell you it won't work. And so anyway, I absolutely love the idea of metaphors.
I'll
Um,
tell you, I mean, to build on that team metaphor, I played basketball in high school and in college, and I love basketball. But boy, I tell you, you go out there on the football field trying to play basketball, you're going to get hurt.
Oh, very much so.
If you don't
Absolutely.
know the game that you're playing, if you don't know the rules of the game, and if you don't have the equipment and the mentality to play that game, you will literally get hurt. And the same is true for leadership. You've got to know the rules of the game that you're playing. You don't necessarily have to agree with them, but you'd better abide by them and know how to navigate with them within those rules, or your organization is going to get hurt.
Absolutely. Well, I love that segue into the next topic I want to pursue is leadership. So, is there a leadership philosophy, a model, or some body of literature that you kind of use for leadership? This is your guiding, your North Star, if you will, that guided you in leadership.
Yeah, I've really kind of thrown it all into the goulash, right? And I've studied so many of these leadership gurus. I've enjoyed Marcus Buckingham. I've enjoyed Simon Sinek. I've enjoyed, John Maxwell, all of these folks, Potter. But I've come to develop my own belief that there are three priorities in leadership. And by leadership, I'm not necessarily always talking about the person at the top of the org chart.
No,
But for me, leadership comes down to three priorities. The first priority is to paint a very clear picture of what success and winning looks like. You got to paint a very clear picture of what does it look like when we win, when we're successful. Number two, you've got to be able to identify and remove barriers that might inhibit winning. You gotta, I look down the road and say, this is something that JT or Bob or Ted might run into, and then get busy working on removing those barriers before Ted gets there. And then the last priority, and by no means the least important, just the third in the series of three, is you got to keep people inspired to want to achieve the mission. Because if you don't keep people inspired, they're going to find other reasons to deviate. People have their own lives, they have their own ambitions, their own aspirations. And so as the leader, your job is to identify and clarify what winning looks like, identify and remove barriers, and keep people inspired to want to achieve the mission.
wow, those are phenomenal. Those are great, and I don't think I've ever heard it said quite that way. So, when's the book coming in?
Well,
I mean,
there's a book that's
there's a
out
book there.
there.
There is a book in those three. I mean, I love it. Paint a clear picture of success, identify the barriers to winning, and get them out of the way, and keeping people inspired so they achieve. Wow, short, to the point. At least be a good ebook. So I'll buy it as soon as you tell me that it's published. In fact, I'll even write the forward for you.
Well, there's a
But,
book that's out there that I wrote in 2017 called Impact, a Leadership Fable, Your Power to Make a Lasting Difference. And I specify those three priorities. And just the more that I've spoken to organizations and other leaders, the more convinced I become that really is what we do as leaders. We
oh,
may do other things, and they could be other good things, but let's not confuse those other things for leadership.
no, I couldn't agree with you more. And I love the last one about keeping people inspired because I think leadership, the essence is that you get things done through other people, with or through other people.
Yeah.
Uh, you know, I like to talk about the three R's of leadership. It's the roles, the responsibilities, and the relationships.
Mm,
You got roles of the leader and the led. You got the responsibilities of what are the outcomes, and of course, leadership is always going to be about the relationship.
yeah.
So I think that absolutely your third point, inspire, touches to that. So that is absolutely awesome. Now, how did you go about developing your leaders in those areas? You spent 30 years raising people, both as sales, but as leadership. And I think those are two overlapping but different things. So, how did you develop folks?
Yeah, let me tell you a little bit about the journey that I was on. When I left corporate America, I started calling myself a coach because when I was in corporate America, anytime you would have a developmental conversation with someone or give them advice, they would call that coaching. And so I left corporate America and I said, well, hey, I'll put out my shingle as a coach. And I started hanging out with professional coaches. And he said, yeah, Galen, you're pretty passionate about this stuff. You got some good stuff there. But if you're going to call yourself a coach, you actually need to go through the training to become a coach. And I was incredibly offended when they told me that. And finally, after hearing that for the fourth time from someone totally different, I said, okay, fine. I'll go check the box of getting certified, take one of these classes, get certified as a coach. And it was 45 minutes into the first day when I realized that what they were saying was absolutely true, that there's a tremendous difference between what I was doing, which was advising and consulting, and what it means to actually be a coach. So when someone comes to me and says, Galen, I'm thinking about going to work for the Coca-Cola company and I want to know how to make this sale, I can give you some great advice. I'm probably going to be a terrible coach because I know so much about what you need to do. I'm going to be tempted to tell you what to do. Coaches don't ever tell you what to do. Coaches pull the information out of you. They pull the wisdom out of you. I believe that all of my clients are brilliant. They're all brilliant. So it's not my job to tell them what to do. I barely got my own life figured out. It is my job, however, to help them clarify what they already know that they need to do, and then to give them support with the courage to take the steps that they already know that they need to take. And that's all I do as a coach is I just step into the space, help them clarify, and then give them the courage. Every now and then I might give them some suggestions on processes to clarify their thinking, but you don't want me helping you build a rocket like my
Really,
clients at SpaceX. You really don't want me doing that.
really. No, I think that's kind of a classic approach to coaching, at least like the International Coaching Federation and so forth, our ideal of how we approach it. That there's the dignity of the client, but the answers are probably they say the answers are there. I'm not sure I agree with that wholeheartedly. Nonetheless, as you just pointed out, you got to first of all help them clarify, get clarity about what you're struggling with, what's clarity of the problem, what's clarity of the shortfall, so forth, and then help them. And like you, I definitely think an injection of an idea or two sometimes is very helpful to them to connect the dots and move forward. So,
Yeah.
as you were telling the story, it's like Heathcliff says, I resemble that. I kind of had the same attitude when I started. Wow, I've got all this other training, I've got all this other stuff, and how to ask questions and so forth. Wow,
Yeah.
go do the training. Go do the training.
I'll tell you that the coaching part of it really does speak to who I try to be as a person. And that's because I really do believe that we all know what we need to do. It's just that the part of the brain that controls knowing is not always the part of the brain that controls language. So I can know something and not be able to explain it. And if I can't explain it, I have a tendency to think, well, I must not know. You mentioned the fact that if I do this thing right in 2 weeks, I will have been married for 29 years. I got my fingers crossed. 2 weeks, that's a long time frame. But if someone were to ask me, Galen, of all the women in the world, of all the women that you've met, of all the places that you've been, how do you know that this one is the one? Well, I know, but it's kind of hard for me to explain, right?
Uh,
Well, just because I can't explain it doesn't mean that I don't know. I just need to work with someone to help me articulate it. I think leaders are the same way. We know what we need to do. It's just hard for us to explain it at times.
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think helping people get that clarity of their own thinking or clarity about what they don't know
Mm,
and don't guess. If you don't know, don't guess. Let's go find out and don't be lazy. Go do the
mm.
research about how to do that. And so, what have been some of your successes in coaching leaders? What have you seen in people as they grow and develop through your coaching programs?
Yeah, so I think my success or the experiences that I enjoy the most in coaching is number one on the front end when I'm coaching someone and they tell me what they want to work on, and when my internal dialogue is, wow, I see why you need a coach for that one. That's a doozy. Woo. I don't have any advice to give you. I can't tell you how to do that at all. When I have that reaction, then all that's left is my coaching process. All that's left is my genuine curiosity and my desire to help you clarify, and my desire to help you figure out how you're going to solve this, because I'm curious to know how you're going to solve this big issue. That usually ends up in a great coaching session for the client. And my one of my biggest successes that I've enjoyed the most when I was in corporate America was in the same year I promoted 2 people on my team skip level positions, where they were able to skip over the next position and get the position above that. I just enjoy seeing people achieve what they didn't necessarily think was possible and what other people in the organization didn't think was possible. I really enjoy that.
That is awesome. Well, thank you for sharing that. And I thank you for pointing out, and I hope our listeners catch it, believe in the process.
Mm,
Oh my gosh. So many times I've seen, whether it's in leadership, it's in sales, it's in manufacturing, you get a problem and you want to throw out the process and somehow come up with something creative, a brand new solution to a problem that's you think is new. I don't think there's too many new problems, or just recycling. But I've seen so many people want to throw out well-established, well-defined processes. Even in coaching, there's a structure, there's a process
yeah.
to how to tee it up and ask questions and so forth. But if you just execute the process you've been taught, I'd say 99 times out of 100, it's going to get you where you need to be.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the process is what helps you showcase the brilliance of the client's
Oh,
brilliance.
yes. Thank
Consulting showcases my brilliance, right?
you.
Consulting, mentoring, I get to talk about my mom's favorite subject, and that's me. And my mom loves it. But my clients are just so much smarter than I am about what it takes to be successful in their own lives and in their own business. And it's kind of outrageous for me to think that I can come in after knowing them for 2 hours or 3 hours and tell them more about what they need to do to be successful than they already know.
Let me explore something with you, if you don't mind, for a minute. A few minutes ago, as you were mentioning about you were holding back. You were holding
Mm,
back, and
yeah.
you referred to it as something you learned as an African American, that I can't show all my cards and so forth. Um, do you think there's still a divide between white and black as we coach folks?
Huh. Interesting question. I had a great conversation with another brilliant dude. He's a coach. His name is Jared Simmons, but he's literally technically brilliant. I mean, McKinsey brilliant, Harvard Business School brilliant, Procter and Gamble brilliant. Just I used to say smart for no reason, but he puts his smarts to good reason. And he's also African American. And on my podcast, we had this conversation about, is a coach. So once you've been trained, once you've been certified, once you know the process, you kind of coach everybody. Or is there value in having a coach who looks like and has experienced some of the same things that you've experienced? So, do African American clients do better with African American coaches? Do female clients do better with female coaches? Or is a coach? And we decided in that conversation that a coach is a coach is a coach. Once you've gone through the process, I
Mhm.
coach everybody literally all over the world. English as a second language, English as a third language. I can coach anybody.
Me too.
And there is value to having someone who can understand and identify with what you're struggling with. And that doesn't mean that you can't get there. It's just that I might get there faster because I get it, right?
Right.
And that doesn't mean that I can't coach a Caucasian, a white male. It just means that there might be some things that my client is going through that it might take me a little while to get to, right?
Right.
Just because we've got a difference of background.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you say it that way, because I guess I'm an idealist and I really take to heart Martin Luther King Jr.'s, speech about character. And absolutely, I think, yeah, if you're going to be a good coach, it ought to be to anybody, male or female, black, white, anything in between, because you're absolutely, above all else, you want to respect the dignity of the person.
Yeah,
There's no way we can all have exactly the same experiences. So
exactly.
it's something different. Well, thank you for sharing that with me. I really appreciate it. Um, well, before we wrap up, we're unfortunately running out of time. What are three things you would tell people? Here's three practical steps about leadership. What are three things you'd share with my audience?
Yeah, coincidentally, the three things that I would share that tend to be practical for being an effective leader are also three things that I rely on for being an effective coach. And that is number one, ask questions. I had an opportunity to study with Hal Gregerson, who's the author of Questions Are the Answer. And he basically says that the way you make a name for yourself early in your career is by having all the answers, having the right answers. If a more senior person asks you a question, you can spit off the answer quickly. That's how you make a name for yourself. As you become more senior, having the answer doesn't really distinguish you.
Mm.
Can you ask the questions that will cause the organization to change the trajectory of how they're looking at their problems? So ask questions. Number two, listen to the answers. Listen to your employees, listen to your partners, listen to your customers. We very seldom know what we think we know. We always have a version of the truth, but if we can listen to someone else's version of the truth, eventually we will circle around what the right answer really needs to be for the organization. And then the last thing I would suggest is simplify. Most problems are problems because we try to complicate it. We try to make it so complex to showcase our brilliance, right? But what's really going on here? What's the real issue? Very often I'll ask my clients, they'll give me some massive thing that they need to solve, and it's got, two or three commas in the value of making the right decision. And rightfully, they're concerned and they're curious about how to handle it. And once we go through the process and I ask something like, what's really going on here? They'll tell me what's really going on here. Well, let's solve what's really going on here and not worry about the commas. Let's not worry about the impact. Let's just solve the problem. And you can only do that if you simplify what's going on.
No, absolutely. And I think your sequence is exactly the right way. I mean, the only way you can simplify is because you've asked good questions and then you've listened. And then you can distill it down. And I think you're right. Particularly the more senior you become, the more you've got to distill that down. One other thing I need to ask, I meant to ask it earlier, is you kind of brand yourself the leadership strategist. Tell me
Yes.
what that's about. Tell my listeners, what is the leadership strategist?
Actually, that name was kind of given to me by a client I was working with because we were working on an issue. And in order to try to help get to the solution, we talked about Simon Sinek, we talked about John Maxwell, and then we talked about Barry Sanders, which is a football legend.
Yeah.
And we talked about Ralph Sampson, who was a
Oh,
basketball legend.
yeah.
And then I talked about Miles Davis, and I
Oh,
talked
that's
about,
music.
and then I talked about the Roadrunner cartoon. And so the way we got to this was I will use whatever I have to help you solve your leadership problem, whether it's scripture, whether it's the words of the Buddha, whatever it takes, whether it's a story about my daughter playing high school soccer. I will use whatever it takes to help you get to where you need to be from a leadership position.
That's awesome. So you mentioned one great jazz musician. Who's another your favorite?
Oh my gosh. Well, first of all, Miles Davis is at the top of the list. He stands alone.
Absolutely.
He stands
Absolutely.
alone. John Coltrane, I was exposed to John Coltrane through Miles Davis after understanding his story. Lee Morgan is another favorite of mine. I had an opportunity to interview Craig Holiday Haynes, and he told me that his father, Roy Haynes, they're both drummers, but Roy Haynes at one point was the drummer that appeared on more albums than any other musician living. And when he said that, I could appreciate his saying that, talking about his dad, but I had to check and I pulled out like several of my own albums. John Coltrane featuring this pianist, Roy Haynes was the drummer. Dizzy Gillespie featuring this saxophonist, Roy Haynes was the drummer. So Roy Haynes is up there on that list.
I'm gonna have to go find that. I'm gonna have to go turn on my what iPad or whatever I listen to these days. Some easy listening jazz. I thoroughly enjoy that stuff. Galen, I can't thank you enough. This has been most enjoyable. I hope I can have you back sometime. We can talk about other stuff and just continue our dialogue about leadership, because you obviously have great knowledge to give to people. So any parting thought?
No, just keep working on growing, keep working on building your capacity to lead others. Because at the end of the day, every success and every failure begins and ends with leadership.
Ah, I will leave that as the period for this show. God bless you. Thank you, my friend.
All right, take care.
Now we've got 3 ideas of what to share from today's podcast. So again, what I'd like for you to be able to do is take those ideas, make them your own, reflect on them. What do they mean to you? And then thirdly, commit to an action plan. Commit to actions that you can take to apply what we've talked about today. If you want help, if you want some ideas, if you want some accountability, please contact me. Contact me by sending me a text, 913-306-1499. Put podcast follow-up in the text message, and I'll get back to you within 24 hours. Thank you so much for listening today, and I'll see you on our next broadcast.